One of the architects of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror was Maximilien Robespierre. He was a man who encouraged the executions by guillotine of more than 17,000 people who were regarded as enemies of the revolution. But despite being a man who sent many people to their deaths on the efficient and brutal killing device that had taken the heads of the King and Queen of France, Robespierre himself was sent to the guillotine. His execution was one which was cheered at the very place that King Louis XVI was executed in Paris at the Place de la Révolution. But what is the story of this influential Frenchman's execution, and why did it happen? Join us today as we find out, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Maximilien Robespierre was born at Arras on the 6th of May 1758. He studied law and then in 1789 was elected to become a representative of the commoners of Arras in the Estates General. But at the time France was beginning to get very tired of its king and queen. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had attracted a huge amount of criticism, and the way they ruled in France was seen as disgraceful, especially by the commoners who were suffering heavily. Many could not afford food and were starving, but the royalty were having huge and lavish banquets and spending obscene amounts of money and wealth on clothing, jewellery and other items. The Third Estate, which represented the commoners and the lesser clergy, declared itself the National Assembly, and with this Robespierre then became a leading figure in the ideas of the revolution. He became a democratic and radical figure, and he loathed the king and queen. He presided over the Jacobins, who were a powerful political group who promoted the ideas of the French Revolution and the overthrow of the monarchy. He also encouraged people to rise up about military defeats and the lack of food. Robespierre was a figure who spoke for the king to be put on trial for treason, and he campaigned for the king to be executed and to fall. He had a number of significant enemies, but in Paris he was very popular. He continued to attack the monarchy and call for reform, and he was in August 1792 elected as the first deputy for Paris to the National Convention. The convention then abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic, and the king was then placed on trial for treason, which Robespierre wanted and supported, and the king was executed in January 1793. Following the king's death, there was a struggle for power within the convention, and there was a significant amount of tension between the Jacobins and the significantly more moderate Girondins. The Jacobins used the power of the mobs and the angry people to take control, and the Girondins were arrested. The control of the country passed to the Committee of Public Safety, and Robespierre was a member of this, and over time he quickly became the most powerful and dominating member of the committee. But in France at the time, there was a significant threat to the country from the form of a foreign invasion from countries who were angry that the king and queen had been executed. There was also a significant amount of lawlessness and disorder all over the land, and with this the committee then began to eliminate anyone who they believed was an enemy of the revolution. This was known as the Terror, or the Reign of Terror, and Robespierre was a powerful figure who was in charge of part of this. In a speech he would state why it was necessary, and he said, "If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without terror is baneful, terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the homeland." This was a dark and violent period during the revolution, as radicals seized control of the government and executed anyone who they believed may have been disloyal to the ideas of the revolution. France was ruled by terror, and people had to be incredibly careful about what they said and what they did. The slightest sniff of resistance or opposition could result in someone being thrown in prison or sent to their death on the guillotine. All someone had to do was to accuse someone, and they were usually then considered guilty, and many were executed unfairly. There were people executed who even cut down a tree or a liberty tree, which was adopted as a symbol of the revolution. There were also many other people executed for just saying the slightest negative thing about the revolution. There were stories also of women who were weeping as their husbands were executed on the guillotine, and their tears were then seen as a symbol of defiance, before they were too dragged onto the execution device and were killed. Heads were rolling constantly, and many people were being beaten in the streets. There was bloodshed all over France, but no one could have predicted Robespierre's downfall. As his power increased, his popularity decreased. He recommended that the National Convention proclaim a new official religion for France, the cult of the Supreme Being, but the intensity of the Reign of Terror and Robespierre's power made him a symbol of unpopularity, and many believed he was ruling tyrannically, almost like the monarch was, and in France they had previously executed one. There were French military successes, and these at the time undermined the justification for the brutality of the Reign of Terror, championed by Robespierre. On the 27th of July 1794, Robespierre and his allies were arrested by the National Assembly after a group of rebels got together to conspire against him. There was a struggle, and during this Robespierre was wounded after a bullet hit him in the jaw. But the next day he would be killed. One eyewitness said of the execution of Robespierre, "At 4 in the afternoon, the sinister procession moved out of the courtyard of the Palais de Justice. No crowd of such a size had ever been seen in Paris. The streets were choked with people. Spectators, men and women of all ages, filled every window, and men had climbed onto the rooftops. There was universal jubilation coupled with popular fury. The long-suppressed hatred against these criminals now exploded with double force. Everyone applauded wildly and seemed to be sorry they could do no more. Most of the watchers fixed their gaze on the cart in which Robespierre, his brother, and 2 other men were riding. These miserable creatures were all mutilated and covered with blood. They looked like a band of brigands the gendarmes had surprised in the forest and were unable to arrest without inflicting serious wounds upon them. It would be difficult to describe the appearance of Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty, blood-stained linen. His features were horribly disfigured. A pale pallor made it even more repulsive. He kept his eyes downward and almost closed. Whether that was from the pain of his wounds or an awareness of his misdeeds, one cannot say. Just before arriving at the place of execution, Robespierre was shaken out of his lethargy by a woman who forced her way through the crowd and rushed up to the cart carrying this cannibal. She grasped the cart rail with one hand and threatened Robespierre with the other, saying, "Monster spewed from hell, the thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes and looked at her sadly, and she said, "Go now, evildoer, go down in your grave carrying the curses of the wives and the mothers of France." When the cart had reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried the tyrant down and laid him prone until it was turned for his execution. Whilst his accomplices were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared not to be taking notice. He kept his eyes shut and did not open them until he himself was carried up to the scaffold. Some said that when he saw the instrument of death he heaved a sigh of pain, but before dying he had to endure bitter suffering. After having thrown down his coat, the executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint which the surgeon had put on his wounds. This unhinged his lower jaw from the upper jaw and caused the blood to flow in torrents. The wretched man's head was now no more than an object of horror and repulsion. When at last it was severed from his body and the executioner held it by the hair to show the people, it presented an indescribably horrible sight. Thus perished the fiercest of the savage beasts, the most monstrous criminal that nature ever conceived. On the 2 days that followed, 83 other rebels were put to death, mainly members of the committee or their outlawed accomplices. Robespierre was an influential and important figure in France, who as quickly as he rose to prominence, he fell from grace. He was executed on the very device which took the lives of the king and queen, and he was proclaimed too an enemy of the revolution that he was so influential in. Today he is considered the man who oversaw a brutal period of time in France, which was marked by mass execution of innocent people and great lawlessness and brutality. But on the guillotine in Paris, he too would meet a brutal and bloody fate. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.